should have a copy of the notes for Jamestown, America's first permanent settlement. Make sure that you put your name on top of this paper, because if you happen to leave it behind, even if it's just notes, I will give it back to you if I know whose it is. I find notes all the time that are filled out that have no name on them. So you will have a test. You will need to study these notes. So make sure that you put your name on the top of it. So this is Jamestown, America's first permanent settlement. Roanoke was an attempt to create a permanent settlement from the English, and it was not successful. So we're going to get into talking about Jamestown. Make sure that if you hear me say anything that's not necessarily in the notes, but it's in this recording, that you actually put it on your notes if you think it sounds important, because I can use anything from notes, even if it's just discussion on a test. So you might want, if it sounds important, write it down. Jamestown Colony is when we talked about Roanoke, we talked about that Queen Elizabeth grants Sir Walter Raleigh a charter or a contract. She gives him 10 years to be able to establish a successful colony in the New World. At the end of that 10 years, Sir Walter Raleigh has not done this because both attempts to settle Roanoke were failures. And so Queen Elizabeth is no longer the monarch of England. It is now King James I. And so he is the one who is in charge of who he's going to give the charter to. And he actually grants it in 1606 to a group of investors called the Virginia Company. And these are just a group of men who have put all of their money together that want to they want to establish a colony in the New World so that they can make money off of it. This goes back to the whole idea of God, gold, and glory. They want to make money off of it. They want the glory of being able to say they did it, but they also want to make money off of it. They want to make that gold off of it. In this time, they organized the group together to settle Jamestown, and it includes 144 men and boys come to settle the colony. So they send all males at this time, which is very similar to the first Roanoke colony, which was the Lane colony. When it was all men, they did not send boys to the Lane colony, but in the Jamestown colony, they decided to send boys to the colony to help out. They have not sent women at the time, kind of sort of the same reason that Sir Walter Raleigh decided not to send men at the beginning, because they felt that it was too dangerous and that the men needed to be able to come over and establish the colony before women actually came.
Haley Stewart, please come to the front.
It is named, of course, in honor of King James. Jamestown was settled in 1607 on the James River in modern-day Virginia. And what that means is that there's a river that flows through what we call Virginia today. This James River empties into the ocean right near the Chesapeake Bay. And if we were to go visit it today, we would actually be in the state of Virginia. Make sure that you have filled in your notes for each slide. This is a picture of what the James Fort at Jamestown looked like. When they settle, you can see down here, this is where the James River is at, and it flows kind of sort of out this way into the ocean. And you can see they've built this fort right along the river. Now, we already know the reasons they would do this, the benefits of it. They would have transportation. They would be able to get in and out easily to England, because they are on the east coast of the United States still, and they can travel back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. They also have not only access to fresh water when they're here, but they also have lots of food in the area. But you notice they build this fort in like a triangular shape, and so inside of it is where they build their buildings, and you can see what the plan of what they expected it to look like. Down here would be the unknown creatures. They don't know of what's in the water. This is the Discovery, the Godspeed, and I believe that's the Susan Constant that is there. And they draw this map to represent that out in this area are woods and also Native Americans. And this is what you would call a palisade. It is a fence that is meant to keep dangers out of the fort. If you remember when we talked about Roanoke, when Sir Walter Raleigh sends over the second group of colonists, the White Colony led by John White, he intends not to send them to Roanoke. Roanoke down in here was already a disaster. They had already made Native Americans mad with them. They had already figured out from the Lane colony that this was not a good spot for a colony. And so this was not the intended spot for the lost colony to come, for the white colony to come. And so he actually wanted to come up into this area, this is Chesapeake Bay, and he wanted to settle somewhere in this area. But if you remember, when they were coming over, the pilot who was bringing them over, he gets to this area to where Roanoke is at, and he refuses to go any further because he wanted to go off and attack Spanish ships. And he tells them, I think it was Simon Fernandez maybe, he tells them to get out. He said, either you get out or you go with me. And so the lost colony was forced to get out at Roanoke, or the white colony was forced to get out at Roanoke, and that's when they become lost. So actually it was Richard Grenville. Sorry, I just saw that. It was Richard Grenville that refused to take them that far north. And so this is where Serrato Raleigh knew that this would be a good idea to settle. He thought it would be a better idea to settle here than where they actually went. And I think he was right, because they did end up getting lost. And maybe had they went up into Chesapeake, it would never have actually became the lost colony. Important events that take place at Jamestown and people. Captain John Smith is probably one of the most important people that was there. He was not the first leader. He comes in and he actually rises up and replaces poor leaders. He organizes the colony in military fashion, meaning that he wants it ran strict. He wants somebody in charge. He wants people working all the time, and he is that person that ends up in charge. Most of the people who were there were what you would refer to as gentlemen. They were some of the more well-to-do people that were in England. They came there thinking that they were going to make a lot of money off of it, and not so much worried about their survival skills. These were people who had never had to do a whole lot of stuff for themselves, a little bit fancier than actually getting out chopping wood and things like that. And so when they come over, they think that everybody else is going to do the work for them. And Captain John Smith finally takes over this colony that is struggling, and he tells them, if you don't work, then you're not going to eat. He enacts this important policy that you need to know, that you need to make sure you remember. If you don't work, you don't eat. In other words, everybody's got to contribute to this colony, and if you don't, I'm not allowing you to have any food. And that sounds really strict, but he wanted to make sure these people actually survived. And so sometimes we have to have people who are strict on us and make us follow rules and make us do things because it's for the betterment of us, even though we don't necessarily like it. And Captain John Smith was not liked very well at all, because they didn't want to do what he told them to do. This is an example of what they would look like, gentleman versus a farmer in the 1600s. These people that came over were more like what you see here on the left, this guy in this peach or pink looking jacket. It kind of looks peachy, like a peach color to me. But they were more, this would be what a gentleman would, I would be talking about, somebody who was not used to doing hard work. Whereas if they had brought 144 farmers over, you wouldn't have had to have worried about this. Captain John Smith wouldn't have had to have been so hard on these people. So you can see the difference between what came over here and probably what should have came. It probably should have been more farmers than people who were worried about how they looked. Is their wig in place? Are their clothes clean and things like that? And this is what people were more worried about. Important people and events continued. There is a gunpowder explosion. John Smith is injured in this gunpowder explosion. There were some questions about was he intentionally injured? Was it an accident? Back then they carried gunpowder attached to their body so that if they ever needed it to shoot a wild animal or an enemy, they had it right with them. And so some people think that maybe John Smith was injured in an accidental gunpowder explosion because he was asleep. Maybe some embers from a fire landed on it and it caused the gunpowder to explode. Some people think maybe the other people that were in the colony that did not like him, who wanted him out, who did not like him being so bossy and doing the if you don't eat, then you don't, if you don't work, then you don't eat. Maybe somebody intentionally caused the gunpowder to go off. I kind of sort of lean toward possible sabotage because Captain John Smith was an extremely smart man, and I think he would have had more sense than to lay down near any fire with gunpowder attached to his belt or anything like that. But it did explode, regardless of whether it was an accident or whether he was sabotaged. It did explode. It created a very, very, very bad wound on his leg, and he actually has to end up leaving England. So John Smith is injured pretty badly on his leg, bad enough that he actually has to return back to England for treatment. I'm really surprised that he did not get a really bad, serious infection in this. I'm really surprised that he actually lives. So if you think about what I just said, he actually had came in and taken over as a leader on some weaker leaders. And the colony does well under John Smith, only the people don't like him. And sometimes people that are toughest on us are the people who actually are the best for us, whether we like them or not. And I think things would have went a lot better for these people if John Smith actually could have stayed in power. Now, was it accident, sabotage? As I said, I'm kind of sort of leaning towards sabotage, but there's never been actually any definitive answer as to whether or not it was accident or sabotage. So no proof. George Percy is another important person, and he was one of the most outspoken against John Smith. He was not happy with John Smith. He was one of these gentlemen. He did not want to work as John Smith wanted him to do, and so a lot of people suspected that perhaps George Percy was behind the injury that happens with the gunpowder to Captain John Smith, because as soon as John Smith has to leave, George Percy comes and takes over as a leader. He is suspected of causing the Smith's injury. He is a weak leader. He was also the leader during a period of time called the starving time, when things get really bad for the people at Jamestown colony. An important event that takes place, I just mentioned, was the starving time. This is a time when the colony had grown to around 500 people. They kept sending more people over and more people over on ships into that little fort. The people that were there were already struggling, and more people come in. So you've got more people in a small space who need food, and things just weren't going so great for them. Kind of sort of the exact same things that were going on back when Roanoke. They did not plan very well. Winter sets in, the winter of 1609 to 1610. We know that that's a time of year that you don't have a whole lot of things like berries and acorns and pecans and walnuts and things like that growing. And so you're having to rely on you can't really grow corn and stuff like that. So it's after the growing season. Winter comes in, it gets cold in the area. And so not only are they cold, but they have a lack of food and supplies. They have not brought a whole lot of stuff over with them. Nobody has sent them as many supplies because it's just not easy to travel across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1600s and end up where you're supposed to be. So a lot of people start starving during this time. They're forced to stay inside the fort. They have angered the Native Americans with them. You see with the Roanoke and the Jamestown colony that they keep having this really bad habit of making the people who could help them in the area angry with them. And they did the same thing here. The thing that the Native Americans were most angry about in Jamestown is that we come into a difficult time, and the Native Americans are used to having plenty of food in this area. And now you've got about 500 people who have came in, and the supplies of food, of whatever wild animals there are, have decreased because you have put so many different settlers in the area who are eating it. Any berries that could have been picked and saved are gone. Any acorns, walnuts, pecans, anything that could have been taken and saved, grapes, anything that could have been saved for the winter time is gone. The Native Americans get really angry with them. And so they're basically told that if they come out of the fort, that they're going to be killed. So if you remember that picture I showed you earlier of the triangular shaped fort, that palisade, that fence, they are trapped inside of that. So there's lots of people. It's extremely crowded, and they're trapped inside of this fort, and they're not allowed to come out, because if they come out, the Native Americans are going to attack them and kill them, because the Native Americans don't want them getting what little bit of food is left in the area. If they stay inside, they are bound to starvation because there's almost no food in the area, and the diseases are rampant. They have brought diseases over on the ships as more settlers come in, and these people keep getting sicker and they keep dying, and so they're forced to stay inside this fort with dead people, with dying people. And if you think about, we're not going to get too specific about this, go into too much detail, but think about inside that fort, you've got all of these people that are using bathrooms that they don't have bathrooms like we do. It would have basically been some type of outhouse or a hole in the ground or something, and that's going to seep down into the water supply, because we know that water comes from underneath the ground. It would have been a stream. There, we do know that John Smith had a well built inside of Jamestown, and so all of that stuff starts to contaminate. Rotten bodies and body waste from using the bathroom and stuff begins to contaminate the water supply, which makes people even sicker. The Indians are hostile. They are led by Chief Powhatan. He is the head of the Powhatan people. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced Powhatan, but I pronounce it Chief Powhatan. Situation is desperate. A little girl by the name of Pocahontas feels really bad for them. This is Chief Powhatan's daughter. She's a young girl, probably around, I'm not for sure, maybe 11, 12, 13 years old. We're not really for sure, but she sneaks food to the colonists, even though her father, Chief Powhatan, is not happy with them. She feels bad for them. She has befriended them, and she begins to sneak food to them within inside of the colony. So I think it was Pocahontas really played a larger role in their survival than she's ever given credit for. George Percy is the leader. I don't think that they would have ever gotten in this situation if John Smith had been the leader, because he would have made sure that, well, instead of sitting around and worrying if their wig is on straight and if their shoes are shiny, he would have made sure they had food for the winter, and he would have made sure that relations with the Native Americans stayed good. And this was something that George Percy did not worry about. He was not worried about winter. By spring, only 60 colonists have survived inside of that colony where I told you that there were over 500 people at one point in time. So during that winter, so many people died that they only have 60 left. It was a devastating time, and that is why it's called the starving time. So many people starved to death, and so many people died of diseases. The starving time ends with the spring, and when they actually are allowed to come out of the fort, there is a new leader has came over called Lord De La Warr, and these colonists who just survived time, they're ready to leave. They're ready to go back to England through a horrible time of no food inside of this colony, of dying of fear, and just the terrible things that we can't even really imagine that they experienced, and they're ready to go back. And Lord De La Warr actually comes over, and he's bringing supplies with him, and he promises them, just give me one more chance. If you give me one more chance, I'll stay as leader. I've got plenty of supplies. We've got more people here to build this colony up and try to make it successful. And so he actually convinces these colonists to stay and keep trying to make this a successful colony. He doesn't want to give up quite that easily. So he does kind of sort of continue along with John Smith's idea of everybody working, but he was not quite as harsh as John Smith was. But I think that those 60 people who had actually survived the starving time, they saw what it was like to have a strong leader. And I think that they probably were wishing a lot of that time that John Smith had actually continued on as being their leader instead of George Percy taking over, and maybe they would not have been exposed to the horrors that they were exposed to. Lord De La Warr, like I said, is a lot more well liked than John Smith was. And if you look at his name, Lord De La Warr, there's a state that was named after him. Can you guess what U.S. state was named after him? Yes, it was Delaware. Delaware was named after Lord De La Warr. Talked a little bit earlier about Pocahontas, that she was the one who she comes in and she gives food to the colonists during the starving time. She was an Indian princess. She was Chief Powhatan's daughter. She did befriend John Smith. Sometimes people think that she actually married John Smith, but John Smith was a lot older than her. So she would not have married John Smith. She did give them food during that time because she cared about them, and she was just a little girl who thought that she wanted to help these people out. She thought they were nice people and she wanted to help them out. She did not dislike them as much as her father did. Her real name was Mataka. Pocahontas was actually a nickname that her father gave her. It meant for a playful one. She ends up marrying a man by the name of John Rolfe. He was an Englishman that came over to the colony. She ends up converting to Christianity. She has a new name. She takes on what she considered, or what was considered to be, a Christian or a European name. And so she changes her name to Rebecca. So Pocahontas actually became Rebecca Rolfe. She became more European-like, meaning that she began to dress more like European women did. So instead of wearing her Native American outfits, she began to wear more dresses and hats and things, bonnets like those women would wear. She and John Rolfe ended up having one son and they named him Thomas. She was old. She had been there for a little bit. John Rolfe had actually been there. He didn't come until a little bit later. And so she was an older girl, still young, but an older girl when she actually married him. She did not look like this. This was a picture that on the left is a cartoon image of what Disney, it portrays her to look like in the cartoon. But on the right is a drawing or an engraving of more what she looked like. And this is what she would have looked like when she actually visits, she goes and visits England. And so this is when I say she became more European-like. She began to dress more like them with the fluffy clothes and hats and things. Chief Powhatan was Algonquin. He was Pocahontas' dad. It is believed that, at least some legend says, that he actually tried to kill John Smith and that Pocahontas saves his life. There's been some discrepancy between historians and John Smith's account. John Smith says that, talks about how they're fixing to beat him in the head and kill him, and that that Pocahontas actually comes in and lies across them and tries to stop her father. And some historians believe that this may not have been true, that the way it was described by John Smith, it may have been a ceremony where Chief Powhatan was going to pretend to kill these people, and that his daughter's role was to come in and try to stop it. So was it really a ceremony, and he had no intention to kill him, or was John Smith telling the truth when he says that Chief Powhatan was going to kill him and little Pocahontas saves his life? Maybe. Nobody knows for certain. At least John Smith told it. I believe that John Smith probably believed that he was fixing to be killed, and that's why he told it. But I don't really know what Chief Powhatan's goal was. He had not been known to kill any of the other Europeans, so why he would kill John Smith, I don't really know. I think that Chief Powhatan, if he'd have wanted to kill them, he would have. But Chief Powhatan does grow hostile toward the colonists in general. He's just tired of them being there. He was in the area at the time that the Roanoke colonists were there. And so he's really kind of sort of done with the Europeans after a period of time. Ironically, as I told you earlier, his daughter Pocahontas grows up and marries one of the Englishmen. So there's a little irony there. He got tired of them and she grows up and marries one of them. John Rolfe, the man who ends up marrying Pocahontas, he introduced tobacco farming to the colony. He comes over and he brings tobacco seeds, and he figures out that the area that Jamestown is in is very good for growing tobacco. The Virginia area is, the climate and the soil of Virginia is very much like North Carolina's, and so he figured out that you could grow tobacco there. Tobacco that would not grow well in Europe grew extremely well in Virginia, and we know today that it grew very well down into North Carolina. And so he tries it there, and he grows a lot of it. And you can't really grow it in Europe, so it was hard to get in Europe. The climate is too cool and damp for it. It rains more there. And so they grow it. Once Jamestown has survived the starving time, he comes over, he brings in these seeds, and they begin to grow it, and they grow lots of it because it grows so well, and they put it on ships, and they take it back to Europe, and they sell it throughout Europe, and John Rolfe becomes really rich. And so Jamestown actually begins to be able to look after itself because it begins to make money off of the tobacco that it's sending back to Europe and selling. So Pocahontas, not only did she change her name to Rebecca Rolfe, and when she married John Rolfe, she became extremely wealthy. She ended up dying a young girl, or a young lady, when she was young, she gets sick. But she does become extremely rich, and she goes over to England, and she meets the royal family over there, and she goes on tour of there, and but she does end up dying. But she was a very rich girl. She became very rich when she married John Rolfe. Jamestown thrives. The soil and climate are great for tobacco, much like it is in North Carolina. As I said, colonists focus on making the colony accessible. They work really hard to make Jamestown successful. They become more self-sufficient. They quit relying so much on the Native Americans and so much on, are we going to get supply ships in from England or not? And they learn how to cultivate vegetables and grow things and make sure we're ready for the winter. And they get focused. They become self-sufficient. They are able to look after themselves. They finally get themselves to a point to where if no other ship ever comes in from England, they could survive. And that would be self-sufficient. This is what tobacco looks like. This is actually at where Jamestown Fort was at. If you see those houses in the background, they are replicas. You can go visit it today and see and walk in and see what they look like. They know they had good drawings and sketches of Jamestown, so they know what it looked like. And so this tobacco was growing just on the outside of the palisade or the fence, and that was where their vegetable garden was at. They didn't really grow much of their vegetables on the inside, which kind of sort of gets into why during the starving time, everything that they could have had was on the outside, and the Native Americans would not let them come out of that fence or they would kill them. African slavery actually starts at Jamestown. It arrives in America in 1619, because by 1619, Jamestown was a full working colony where there was people in and out, in and out. They had so much land that they wanted somebody else to help farm it. And so the Dutch ships, it was the Dutch that actually starts bringing African slaves into America. And the reason they would choose the people from Africa to come here and to force them to come here as slaves was because they understood agriculture and how things grow. By 1660, a full slavery system was established in Jamestown. Jamestown most likely would not have succeeded if it had not been for the African slaves that came in, because they could grow all of this tobacco and send it back to Europe and sell it. They could grow it, but it was hard to actually keep it up, to keep the weeds chopped out of it, to go out and tend to it, and to actually cut it down when it's time to be harvested. They grew so much that there wasn't enough colonists to do it, so they bring in and start the slave system. So if you were asked where slavery started in America, it started at Jamestown in 1619. That's super important, and you need to know it. Was not the first time that slavery started in the world. There was slavery throughout different parts of the world. But when did it start in America? It started in 1619 at Jamestown. The House of Burgesses is also super important. It was the first time that there was a government in America. It was, of course, ran by England, but it made all the laws for the colony. The members had to be elected by the people that lived inside of the colony. So if you wanted somebody on the House of Burgesses to represent you, they had a voting system. So the first, not only did, in 1619, not only did African slavery start, or the slavery system start in America, but the first government as we know it started in America. It was controlled by England. It was English government that was here in America, and it had to all be approved by Parliament over in England, but government did start at Jamestown. Slavery starts at Jamestown. American government starts at Jamestown. House of Burgesses is what it was called. The lost colony. Early Jamestown colonists searched for the lost colony. They continue to search for it. They are told that the lost colony died in an Indian. The last video left off. I was beginning to talk about lost colony, and I'm sorry, but it cut off, and so I'm gonna go back a bit. The lost colony. The colonists at Jamestown was settled only about 20 years after the lost colony went missing. And so the Jamestown colonists still continued under the direction of England, and Sir Walter Raleigh did continue to search for the lost colony. They wanted to know what happened to this group of people. And so they search around, and they are told that they were killed in an Indian war. Chief Powhatan said that he had them killed. There's been no proof of this. I don't know really why Chief Powhatan would say he had them killed, except for he wanted these new colonists at Jamestown to fear him. I think it was more of he wanted his reputation. He wanted to make sure that they feared him, that they felt like they didn't need to cross him, because if you killed off the white colony or the lost colony at Roanoke, that you may kill off us as well. I don't really think Chief Powhatan would have killed them, because I think you would have known it a long time before. And I think there still would have been evidence of the bodies. I've mentioned that before. When we talked about Roanoke, there was no evidence of where the bodies were left. There were, and I mentioned this at the end of the Roanoke PowerPoint, that there were reports in the area of Indians with English features, meaning that you saw Indians typically, Native American Indians typically had dark hair, pretty tan, dark skin, and dark brown eyes. And so you begin, the Jamestown colonists report seeing some people that were Native American that had, and even later after the Jamestown colonists, reported seeing maybe blue-eyed or blonde-haired Indians, or maybe even with red hair or something along the lines of that. And so it made them believe at least it was possible that the Roanoke colony had actually, the one that became lost, actually assimilated in with the Indians, with an Indian tribe, possibly the Croatans, and began to live with them and married with them. But the Roanoke colonists were never found. Jamestown looked for them for many years, and they never found them. And we still to this day don't know. It's still America's biggest mystery that we still research and we try to find. And there's a possibility sometimes that we think we are on to it, to figure out what happened to them, but there's just never been an answer as to what's happened to them. And I don't know for sure that we'll ever know what happened to them. This is that was an aerial shot of Jamestown, and there's a video there that will play. I'm going to play it, and you can watch the video and just have a look around at the Jamestown settlement.
Our nation's fragile beginning is marked in the ground you walk on Jamestown Island. You can trace the footsteps of Captain John Smith, Pocahontas, and the settlers who gave their lives to build Britain's first permanent colony in North America. It's easy to imagine that adventure because the island looks much like it did when the colonists landed in May 1607. Eagles and blue herons soar over the woods and marshes along the island's scenic drive. Turtles sun themselves in the tar swamp, safer now than they were then when colonists ate turtles to survive starvation. And inside the footprint of the original James Fort, archaeologists bring those early years to life by uncovering the colonists' own tools and treasures. You can witness the moment of discovery of precious items that have been in the ground for 400 years. The Visitor Center's galleries will set the stage for 1607 by showing the cultures of the English, the Africans, and the Powhatan Indians before they came together at Jamestown. A variety of tour opportunities will help you to trace that contact. Learn from park rangers who have studied Jamestown for decades. Meet the archaeologists who will show you their work to find the items used by the settlers and Indians who made a life at the fort. The results of their work are on display inside a museum dedicated to the archaeological project, the Voorhees Archaearium. You will see the finds from 20 years of digging, helmets and halberds, dice made from bones, a crystal arrowhead, Powhatan pottery, and a slate inscribed with writings and drawings, possibly made by shipwrecked settlers. Enjoy lunch on the banks of the James River at the Dale House Cafe. Walk inside the brick tower from a 17th century church, the only above-ground structure from early Jamestown that has survived. And, as you leave the island, stop at the end of the Causeway Road to see the artisans in the glass house perform one of the earliest industries attempted on the island. You can join in the rediscovery of Jamestown, where America tells her own story in the hallowed ground along the James River.